Today, we'll talk more about Russia. Yesterday, we talked about early Russia, and that's what the bell ringer was about. And then the activity. Of course, went over some of both what we talked about yesterday and what we'll talk about today. So hopefully you were able to get to that. Don't forget to submit the document once you're done. And then don't forget about, of course, the assignment from yesterday, which was the reading assignment that went along with each of those web pages. So the Russia activity, once again, make sure that you had the items highlighted that were significant on the right, and then comments and questions on the left. So don't forget to submit that document as well. But you'll have some more time to work on that after we're done with the notes here in class. And if you did get through that entire assignment, you'll notice that it started off with Ivan the Terrible, which we talked about yesterday, and that went up through and including the Russian Civil War, which happened shortly after the revolution. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And as you can see up on the screen, there's another map of Russia, and it's pointing to two different places. And those two places, especially one of them, has been in the news over the last couple of years because Russia still has an interest in these places. The one on the eastern side includes northern China, but also some of the islands off the coast that were also claimed by Japan. And this region right here gives them access to a warm water port to the south that's known as Crimea. And so that will bring us to two events: the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War. You can see there the Crimean War was from 1853 to 1856. That was before the American Civil War. And the Russo-Japanese War was shortly after the turn of the century, before World War I. And you might wonder, why are we learning about these ones? There are obviously many wars Russia was involved in. What importance do these share? Well, both of these will help lead to the decline of the royal family. Russia fought France, Britain, and the Ottomans. Remember that spelled Ottomans. France, Britain, and the Ottomans for Crimea, which is spelled like it is up there without the N. So just Crimea. So Britain, France, and the Ottomans, they fought Russia for Crimea. And Crimea is this little peninsula that sticks off into the water in one of those seas that then could eventually give you access to the Mediterranean. So the Russians wanted that because, remember, most of their ocean front is in the north and it's frozen most of the year. So they wanted a warm water port, and so they were willing to go to war over it, but unfortunately for them, they lost. And they used a lot of resources to do this, and it also humiliated them. And then on the other side, they obviously wanted greater access to their eastern border to the Pacific Ocean as well. But Japan was starting to become more industrialized. It also wanted access to some of those islands and ports. And so they ended up fighting each other, hence the name Russo-Japanese War. So the Russians and Japanese fought each other over Pacific territory. And Russia also lost that war. And that was exceptionally humiliating because the Japanese were fairly new at doing these kinds of things. Japan was kind of isolated for centuries. And they finally came out of their shell. And one of the first things that they did is they beat this country that had been in existence for hundreds of years. So, using all their resources, taxes, and of course, losing a lot of young men obviously frustrated the people greatly. So, the people were frustrated with these losses. And you can see they're spread apart by a good 50 years. So, this would be multiple generations. Now, you might think, well, now they'll be able to take it easy for a while. They won't have to get involved in anything else for a long time. But actually, that won't be the case because next will be World War I. And Russia will actually be a major player during the war. Russia would actually be on the side of the Allies. So they will be on the side of the Allies. And of course, with them will be France and Britain. So here are two countries they had fought before, but now they're on the same side. And not only are they involved now with their former enemies, they're friends now, but on top of that, Russia is one of the countries that started the war. Now, we don't want to go over World War I history too much. You did that last year. But just to give you an overview, a refresher, you don't have to write this part down. Remember that the Austrian prince was in Serbia and he got assassinated. And you might wonder, what does it have to do with Russia? Well, Serbia and Russia are both Orthodox Christian. And so Russia kind of thinks itself as the parent or protector of all the Orthodox Christian people. And so after that assassination happens, of course, Austria claims war on Serbia. Germany, which is also German-speaking like Austria, joins with Austria against Serbia. So Russia feels like they have to defend them. And because Russia has a treaty with Britain and France, they are dragged into the war as well. But the next thing you can write down is they were not prepared. They were not prepared. Even though they've had a decade since their loss against the Japanese, they are not prepared for the war. And so this is incredibly devastating. And soldiers on the front start to lose confidence in the government. Soldiers on the front start to lose confidence in the government. In previous generations, they'd be willing to go to the death for the Tsar, but now they're saying, boy, this all seems kind of pointless. We don't have supplies. We've already lost 2 wars before this. And so even the soldiers start to lose confidence. And it's actually during the war that we start to see the prelude toward the revolution. And this involves a little bit of a backstory that is important for us to know because it also explains the Cold War as well. So we can start with by typing that Karl Marx, Karl with a K, had written the Communist Manifesto. An incredibly important book. He wasn't the only author. There'd be another guy, but I'm not worried about you learning his name. And in this book, he wrote that industry dehumanized work. Industry dehumanized work. And what does that mean? He meant that when we built factories, especially when they're mechanized and they have assembly lines, it's just the same thing being done over and over again. It's like humans are turned into robots. And so he thought the industry dehumanized work. And of course, they got very little out of it to pay, even though they were making all this equipment and producing at an enormous rate, they were not making that much more money out of it. And so he thought the workers would eventually revolt and seize all property. The workers would eventually revolt and seize all property. And they could revolt violently, or they could revolt through voting. Either way of those, he thought was possible. Once that happened, once they seized control of property, he believed people would play an equal role in a socialist society. People would play an equal role in a socialist society. An equal role in a socialist society. And so that's kind of the two main points of socialism, at least that's what Karl Marx thought, is that the people should own all property together, so no individual person owns a house or a business, and that all people are equal. That might sound nice, but remember, you don't get to have your own stuff. He thought once people forgot about greed, they would work instead to better their community. Once people forgot about greed, they would work to better their community. Because if nobody owns their own property, people won't be worried about building up huge amounts of wealth and buying mansions and all this other kind of stuff. And so he thought people would forget about the greed and just work instead to better their community. And that's, of course, where we get to the word communism. Communism would be a peaceful community, a peaceful, as they call it, utopia. Communism would be a peaceful community. And probably one of the most important people that would read this book would be Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir is Vladimir. That's Vladimir. And Lenin is Lenin. Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin will read that and he knows that his fellow Russians are upset about this costly war. and how they've been dehumanized by having to fight it. The economy was also collapsing because they were stretching the resources. There wasn't enough goods and services for the average person either. So the economy was collapsing. And the government was weak because, in the midst of this, Tsar Nicholas II decided to give up the throne. Tsar Nicholas II gave up the throne. A temporary government was set up, but it was weak. So a temporary weak government was established. Lenin had a political party known as the Bolsheviks. So Lenin had a political party known as the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks is spelled Bolsheviks. 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 The Bolshevik Party wanted to force Russia to become socialist. They wanted to force Russia to become socialist. Lenin didn't want to deal with all of the politics, people debating each other, compromising, passing one law at a time. He thought what Russia needed was to rise up and seize all the property in one swift move. And so, when the weak government still refused to get out of World War I, protests started, and Lenin used that opportunity to seize control of the government. So the weak government refused to exit World War I, and protests started, so Lenin used that to seize control. Shortly after, he changes the name of the party to the Communist Party because he wanted to make it seem like they had gotten to that final step that Karl Marx talked about. But actually, that's not true. Any communist party that has ever existed has never actually achieved communism. They just say that to make it seem like they have. But that's untrue. But Lenin, of course, sticks to the promise that he made. He has Russia drop out of World War I, and they began to take over the entire economy. Now, Lenin and a lot of his friends in his political party, they claimed that they were doing this on behalf of the peasants. But that actually wasn't true either. If you ever look at pictures of Lenin, he and all of his friends are dressed in suits. They were all educated people. Many of them went to college. They had at least some resources. None of them were peasants. And so actually a lot of peasants didn't like the idea because when Lenin came in and said, the government, the people now own all the property. There are a lot of peasants upset about that because the one dream of every peasant is that one day they would own their own what? They would own their own land. And so there are actually a lot of peasants that were mad about this. And so there are actually some uprisings of peasants throughout Russia that the Communist Party had to put down. Let's go ahead and pause there for today. You can use the remainder of the period to continue to work on that Russia assignment or the reading from yesterday, or you can work ahead if you wish. I did send notifications to people if they hadn't turned in the Units 3 and 4 study guide or the slideshow, so please make sure you submit those if you haven't already, or if you didn't submit your essay test, make sure you do that.